once you discover that there are different versions of the Old Testament, depending on the tradition that you're from, you should ask a really simple question. Why? Why do we not agree on exactly what is in the Old Testament? It's a great question, and there's actually a clear answer to that, but it involves us learning some history, and so that's what we're going to dive into today. So let's just get straight into it. Why do some Bibles have different books in the Old Testament? Well, let's think through for just a minute a quick recap of the previous a previous video on which books are actually in the Old Testament. So when we think about it and when we pay attention to it, there's four major traditions: Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. And each of these have different versions of the Old Testament. And they'll differ in terms of the content and the arrangement of the books of the Old Testament. So if you were to pull out Bibles for each of these traditions, you would find slightly different material between them, and you would find different orders of the books. And that's what we're going to dive into. Like, why does that happen? And the second thing that we would notice is that the Jewish Bible serves as the foundation for the other collections. That the point of the most overlap will be with the Jewish Bible. And as a way of reminder, what we call the Old Testament as Christians is just the Jewish Bible. It's just the Bible. That is what it is. There's no New Testament in the Jewish Bible. So just to be clear about that as we're thinking. Okay, so to understand why different traditions identify different books as the Old Testament, we need to learn some history. And there are 5 points of history. We could go into much greater detail, but there's 5 points that I think if you sort of get a grasp on these historical facts, you'll begin to have a better understanding as to why there are different collections of the Old Testament. So that's what we're going to try to go through today, is 5 historical facts to keep in mind. First, the Old Testament developed over several centuries, okay? And this may seem shocking because we're used to the Old Testament just existing as it is, but if you just think critically for a few minutes, you'll recognize that the Old Testament itself has to have developed over time, right? Because we have different stages in history, right? And so because the Old Testament covers different stages in history, that means that certain books didn't exist until later periods, right? And so that process takes time, and it happened over a number of centuries, right? So the individual books, and there's 2 things we want to keep in mind under this one historical fact. First is that the individual books were written and edited in different locations, right? That might also be surprising to you, but we'll talk about it. There's 3 primary locations. Obviously, we have the land of Israel, and this is where the vast majority of the material is going to be written and developed. It's going to happen in the land. But we also know, like from the book of Ezekiel, that some of the Bible was written in Babylon, right? So Ezekiel claims to be in Babylon when he's writing, right? So we know that that's happening. And then we have some interesting evidence from a place called Qumran, and from places in Egypt that actually tell us that the Bible was being edited in places like Egypt. All right, and not only in the land of Israel where Qumran is, but also in the land of Egypt, where there's a strong and flourishing Jewish community in the centuries before the time of Jesus. And we know that there's work going on because we can see that in the different manuscripts that we have. And so the Old Testament is developing. It's being written, and then it's being copied over time in these different places. And so we need to recognize that. And that's going to play an important factor in just a minute. The second is that the different collections within the Old Testament solidified at different stages. If you watch the video on what books are in the Old Testament, you'll see that the Jewish Bible is divided into 3 major sections, right? First, we have the Torah. Second, we have the prophets. And third, we have a section called the writings. And these are developed at different times, and they sort of crystallize into their form at different stages. And it's hard to know exactly when they solidify, but we can pinpoint like the latest point at which we know they're solidified. Okay, and so that's sort of the dates that I'm going to talk about are the latest, on the latest side of when we know that they are solidified. So when we look at the Pentateuch or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we know that when we read, like in the book of Ezra, that they're talking about the Torah as pretty much what we have. And so we know that around the 5th century, at the latest, the Torah seems to have really come into its sort of biblical shape, its canonical form, as you might say. The second collection to solidify is the prophets. Now, this happens obviously after the exile, after the period of the exile. And we can look to books like, there's a book called Ben Sira, and there's some scrolls from Qumran that mention the prophets as a collection. And so we know that at least by the time of Ben Sira and the scroll from Qumran, which is sometime in the 2nd century BC, we know that by then at the latest, we have these collections that are recognized by a community. And so we know that the prophetic literature comes into being at the latest. It finds its biblical shape in the 2nd century. And then when we come to the writings, it's a little bit more unclear to us exactly when things get solidified. But by the 1st century AD, right? So and this is the time of Jesus, the time of the church. In that 1st century, we begin to have lists of the writings as well. And so we know that at the very latest that is when it has taken its shape, right? And so again, we're not sure the earliest side of when these things took place and when they solidified, but we know at the very latest that the writings as the last stage of the Old Testament are solidified into their form pretty much by the 1st century AD. Okay, so that is how the Old Testament is developing, and that's going to help us understand sort of what's going on and why there are different collections, because we need to recognize that as the Old Testament is developing into its sort of biblical form and it's like becoming gathered into these distinct collections, that there's opportunity there for different versions of the Old Testament to be gathered around, because we don't have the printing press, so we don't have like a clear like dissemination of one version of the Old Testament at this time. We have different communities that are preserving their copies, and that's going to open us up to some really interesting developments. The second historical fact to keep in mind is that the Septuagint, commonly referred to as with the abbreviation LXX, came into existence around the 3rd century AD. I'm sorry, not AD, 3rd century BC. And so in the 3rd century BC, we have a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, right? So this is around the time that the Hellenization of the ancient world is happening, where Alexander the Great has conquered, and then from there people begin to really learn Greek. It becomes like the language of the day, and the Old Testament gets developed into that in the 3rd century. And again, this is a typo, the 3rd century BC. So the LXX, the Septuagint, is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it was largely based in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay, so we have, this is where the Old Testament is undergoing some development in the land of Egypt. And some of the books in the Septuagint are actually different than they are in the MT. And for example, like the book of Jeremiah is a different length and arranged in a different order than the one that we find in the Hebrew versions that we have. And so we know that there are some editing and some things happening in Egypt and in the Septuagint. And so we know that there's actually a couple of different versions, like of the book of Jeremiah. There's some interesting differences within the book of Ezekiel that are happening. And so if we can think about it, there's a version of Jeremiah that's more dominant in the land of Israel, and there's a version of Jeremiah that's more dominant in the land of Egypt. And the one in Egypt gets translated into Greek. And that's going to create an interesting situation for us. And then, of course, some of the books that we find in the Septuagint never actually existed in Hebrew, that they were written in Greek sometime around this time. And so that's going to play an interesting factor as well. So the Septuagint gets translated from the Hebrew into the Greek, but then the Christians, as they develop, by the 2nd century AD, the Christians adopt the Septuagint as the primary Bible. Right? So that's what the Septuagint just becomes. And actually, some of the quotations in the New Testament are from the Septuagint. And so the Christians very early on adopt the Septuagint as the primary Bible. So they're not working with a primarily Hebrew text, but one that's written in Greek, which makes sense because many of the Christians are no longer Jewish. They're Gentiles, and many of them are going to be able to operate and function in Greek. So this meant that Christians worked with a larger collection of books, because the Septuagint actually has some books that are not in Hebrew. And it also means that the Christians worked with slightly different versions of the books, right? So Jeremiah is going to look differently. And then you're going to have some extra stories like in Daniel. And so the Christians are going to be operating with a slightly different version, and that's going to become standard for Christianity in the early centuries. The fourth historical fact to keep in mind is that St. Jerome, who famously translated the Bible into Latin, argued for the superiority of Hebrew, and he did this in the 4th century AD. So he is one of the first people to distinguish between the Hebrew and Greek and to prioritize the Hebrew over the Greek. And so that's a really important development that, as we'll see, that gets picked up in later Christianity. But the Catholic Church still prioritizes the Septuagint version in their as their canon, and so that's why they're going to retain all of these books that are different than what they would be in the Hebrew, and that's going to explain why the Catholic version of the Old Testament is going to be different than the Protestant version. And that really comes to play with our 5th historical fact, which is that Martin Luther in the 1500s argued for the superiority of the Hebrew canon. Right? So he goes a step further than Jerome, and he actually argues that the Hebrew canon is what we should do. Now, he's not the first person to sort of make this argument, but him and the other reformers are where this decision really makes a lot of headway. And so he rejected the larger Septuagint-based canon. So he's going to say that is not what we should operate with, but we should operate with the one that the Hebrews, the Jewish people operate with. And so that's what he's going to argue. But the Catholic Church actually affirms the larger canon at the Council of Trent in large response to the Reformation and to Martin Luther. And so they're going to say, no, like Luther is wrong. We need to keep all of these other books. And that really begins to explain why there are different versions of the Old Testament. And so in summary, I want to point out just 2 reasons that we have different versions of the Old Testament. So we've gone through these 5 historical facts. I want to summarize it in sort of 2 reasons why we have different versions of the Old Testament. First, the Old Testament was passed down in slightly different versions, right? So we have Hebrew and we have Greek, all right? And so the Greek would be that Septuagint version that I talked about, and the Hebrew is commonly now develops into what is called a Masoretic text tradition. And so those are the 2 major traditions that get developed, and we can see that they actually differ in some slight ways, and so that's going to play an important role as to why there are different versions. And then second, different traditions prioritized one of the versions, right? So obviously the Jews prioritized the Jewish version, the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, and which is just their Bible. So they just prioritized their text as sacred, which makes perfect sense. But then the Christians are going to divide sort of into 2 camps. Early on, they're going to adopt the Septuagint version, and that's going to become a dominant idea behind why, like, the Catholic and the Orthodox versions of the Old Testament have larger canons. But then the Protestants are going to argue that, in fact, we should adopt the Jewish version of the Bible, and we should stick to that. And so that's why in the Protestant version, you're going to get a smaller canon that looks like the Jewish canon. And that those 2 factors explain why we have different versions of the Old Testament, depending on the tradition that you are a part of.